Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the second panel of today's workshop day, together with Dr. Iuditha Balint, with Dr. Markus Stumpf, and Dr. Manuel Gogos. My name is Nesrin Tanç. Our second panel, Post-Westphalian Literature Archives, is dealing with literature archives. And before I introduce my guests who are working in this field, archives, literature and culture, before I do that, I would like to just say a couple of introductory words from my perspective. Archival materials are central to research on cultural life, and this includes, above all, the literary estates of writers, artists, authors, publishers' archives, artists' associations, as well as municipal archives, libraries, and museums, where you can also, for example, find documents on award ceremonies or other important informations. Archives regulate the accessibility of information. That's a fact that really fuels the discourse about the archive. The archive discourse had its peak in the 1990s, when the change of political systems, the German reunification, the so-called Wende, the transformation, and the reform discourses around the so-called Verbetriebswirtschaftlichung occupied the social and cultural sciences as well as the philologies. So for some time now, also with the DOMIT that Dr. Gogos will talk about in his speech and the social discourses, the archive topic has been booming. I am today speaking and presenting this event as a literary and cultural scholar who has studied Turkish literature about North Rhine-Westphalia, specifically the Ruhr region. I was particularly focused on Fakir Baykurt, just one example, who is a heavyweight in the international reception of regional literature, as well as protest literature and the literature of the village institutes and literature about the so-called guest workers in Germany. He lived in North Rhine-Westphalia for 20 years and wrote a trilogy that was received and perceived internationally as the Duisburg trilogy. He also wrote a novel and several dozen stories about the city of Duisburg, the life in Duisburg, the life in the Ruhr region, and the life in North Rhine-Westphalia and Germany as a whole. He saw himself as an active part of this region and of Ruhr literature, and spent about 20 years writing about the people in this region from a Turkish perspective. He built a network of comrades in arms, such as the publisher Hüseyin Çölgeç'in with the Ortagruf Publish House, or the Münster-based Molla Demirel or Niki Aidenaya. And I particularly enjoyed, Mr. Gogos, to read in your book that Niki Aidenaya brought you to work at DOMIT. I came across Niki Aidenaya through her trilingual anthology Kalimeraba, Greek, German, Turkish reading, co-edited with Arzu Toka in 1992. You briefly discuss Fakir Baykurt in your book, and numerous publications can be found in DOMIT. Iuditha, some publications can also be found in the Fritz Höser Institute as well, and the literature card of the story collection Duisburg Trenne, which we created in 2019, is already hanging in the Fritz Höser Institute. So thank you again for your commitment. So there are numerous cross-connections and links between, for example, the Greek and the Turkish group of writers, publishers, etc., that illustrate the relevance of literary production in different ways on several levels, especially in the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia. I did not find much in the literary and urban historical archives during my research between 2017 and 2019. And that is why I want to focus on this topic during this panel. DOMIT was an important source. Only through the collections and private private archives? Was it possible for me to mark something like historical reference points, for example, for those who we now call post-migrants? And I was able to compile volumes of literary works for my topic, the order of diversity in the Ruhr area. I wrote many times about the situation of archives, and I would like to start our panel by drawing attention to the literal estates of Turkish, Kurdish, Greek, Armenian, Damalian, former Yugoslavian authors, and the safekeeping of historically relevant documents relating to literature in the working groups, publishing houses, and individual actors have so far been largely excluded from this system and from the reception. Also in North Rhine-Westphalia, where a considerable number of descendants of immigrants live. Why is this the case? That's the main question that we try to look at during this panel. And how can we gather the knowledge of literature of this migration system? How can we integrate it into the archives? So with these questions in mind, I would like to introduce my panelists on detail. Dr. Iuditha Balint is a literature and cultural studies scholar, and since 2018, she's also the director of the Fritz Hüser Institute for Literature and Culture of the Working World, based in Dortmund. She studied Germanistics and philosophy in Mannheim and Heidelberg, and received her doctorate in 2015 with a dissertation Erzählte Entgrenzung, Narratives of Work at the Beginning of the 21st Century. In the spring 2022, she will be a Max Kade visiting professor at the University of Cincinnati. Dr. Markus Stumpf studied history, Germanistics, and literature and historical auxiliary sciences in Mainz, Aachen, and Bonn. He did his doctorate in medieval history in Munich after an archival traineeship. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Between 2000 and 2008, he worked in various functions at the Landesarchiv North Rhine-Westphalia, and ever since 2008, he has been working as the head of the LWL Archive Office for Westphalia, which is also the Archive Advisory Office for the non-governmental archives in Westphalia-Lippe. He's also archive director of the so-called Vereinigte Westfälische Adelsarchive. He has been the chairman of the Federal Conference of Municipal Archives at the German Association of Cities. Dr. Manuel Gogos holds a PhD in literature. And I quote, he is the son of a Greek father and the father of a German son. His grandfather was a soldier in the German Wehrmacht. His other grandfather was a Greek smuggler in the resistance movement against the German occupiers. Manuel Gogos works as a freelance author, writes features for Deutschlandfunk, and produces films for Arte. From 2002 to 2005, he worked for the DOMIT in Cologne as part of the Migration Project. The DOMIT is the Documentation Center and Museum on Migration in Germany. Since 2005, he has been operating his agency for intellectual guest work in Bonn. As a curator and curatorial consultant, he is specialized in the museumization of migration history. His book, The Memory of the Migration Society, Das Gedächtnis der Migration, on the culture of memory in the Migration Society and the history of the Migration Museum in Germany, was recently published in October 2021. Welcome to all of you, and congrats on the publication. Dr. Gogos, may I ask you to start with your input, followed by Dr. Iuditha Balint and Dr. Markus Stumpf. Yes, of course. So I'll start right away. I hope everybody can hear me. So I am speaking here on behalf of DOMIT. I wrote this book. DOMIT, the initiative, is 30 years old, and I started back then. Well, it was initiated by Turkish intellectuals, a Turkish intelligentsia in 1980 after the coup d'etat. They had to flee from Turkey and arrived in Germany. They then met other Turkish people in Germany who had arrived here 30 years earlier, who had written their own history in Germany without anybody wanting to read that history or their story. Nobody was interested. And that is why I think it is important to mention Domit, even though Domit isn't necessarily a literature archive, but it is an archive that consists of stories. And that's essential because those Turkish intellectuals then started to write down the stories, the history of those people. They traveled through the whole country, visited people all over Germany, and wrote down these different stories from a perspective of migrants, first-generation migrants. And that is what can now be seen in Domit, in this archive. And after that, during different exhibition projects, in particularly the project Migration that I worked with since 2002. I worked on that project for 3 years, and there we worked with Greek guest workers. So one could say people like my father, and I interviewed them. I asked them about their perspective and whether it was similar to the other perspectives. We then tried to broaden the perspective. We also looked at GDR, contract workers, and another thing that is important about Domit that we have to keep in mind, it's a documentation archive, but at the same time, it's also a place where we collect three-dimensional things. Domit always try to make sure that those stories that can be read there can be connected to objects of things that can be memorized. Or to put it differently, I did that work myself. We talked to time witnesses, that we visited people who lived there, went into their houses and looked at objects that those people have carried with them through their whole life. So that object is related to their story. And within that narrative, within that story of migrants, especially in those important moments of arrival, for example, of change, things occur that are linked to those stories. And at the same time, Domit tried to found a documentation center where that multitude of stories, migration stories, that the whole migrant society can be found there in all its diversity. Because we try to keep the perspective and look at all those different stories. At the same time, of course, we try to conceptually also work on that idea of a documentation museum. So we didn't just want to write down or safeguard those stories. We also wanted to tell the stories. We wanted to make sure that we have a space where we can tell these stories. So we needed to create a museum where that could happen. And what was very nice for me and also very satisfying was that that book ended with a sort of happy end. During the writing, during the research, the decision was taken on a federal government level that the museum would be created. It's going to be located in Cologne so that we can make sure that it's in an urban environment. We're working on the concepts at the moment in order to make sure that there is a place where this multilingualism, this multitude of stories of migrants can be accessible for a society that is affected by migration. We are all part of this transformation process. And yes, that is why we are now talking about a post-migrant society. So this house, this museum is going to open in 2022, an international museum, and the sponsor, or what is really driving this whole idea, this institution, was really this small association of migrants that was founded in 1982 in Essen in a garage. So that's an incredible story if we keep that in mind. And I try to write that story down in my book.
Thank you very much. Dear Iuditha, would you like to continue? Yes, I'd love to. I would also like to say thank you for the invitation. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation. And I had to think of Silicon Valley after what we heard right now, where big corporations are active right now, and we don't know how things are going to develop. So I speak on behalf of the Fritz Hüser Institute for Literature and Culture of the Working World. And yeah, since the very beginning, the principle of diversity was key here, was key for the Institute as well. The Institute was created from a private archive, which was the private collection of Fritz Hüser, who started after the Second World War to collect literature of workers and the working class. That was not an easy task because those works were, as we all know, not the favorite works of the National Socialists. So those works were largely destroyed and not available anymore. Collecting traditional literature, that one thing that Fritz Hüser did was one thing, but he then started also collecting multilingual, bilingual, and multilingual literature. He did so because the so-called guest workers, so migrant workers in Germany, also created literature, and they wrote in their own languages. And those literatures we also have a literature estate in our archive of an Italian guest worker who writes mostly in German but adds and plays with Italian in his work. So if you want to understand that, you need to understand Italian as well. What's also interesting are inventories in Esperanto. So worker Esperanto is something that we have a lot. One colleague of ours works on that. It's a colleague who speaks Esperanto, actually. Then we also have inventories. We have estates from vagabond authors, vagabond painters as well. And they created their works in different languages as well. What's interesting when it comes to the vagabond movement is that that literature is transnational. Boundaries are regularly crossed. Whether boundaries are known in that work, of course, is a different question, but they are crossed. So it's very interesting to have such an archive, which is an archive where different languages are represented. Turkish, Italian, Yiddish, Esperanto, Polish. I just recently found a Hungarian document, and Hungarian is my mother tongue, so I was very happy about finding that document. So it's lovely to have that multitude of languages, but it's also very much needed. And that is what our current focus is. We don't only want to reflect, represent that diversity, we also want to bring it into society. So especially when we have an archive that is focused on a specific topic, such as ours, our archive is focused on the world of work. There's different archives where there are literary estates, premature estates as well. And they exist with private individuals. They have documents in their collections, documents that would really need to be put into an archive. If we want to reflect a majority of society, and when I talk about a majority of society, I don't speak about German-speaking society, but I talk about a multilingual society. And if you want to reflect that in an archive, you need experts, such as I, for example, who know where different pieces are, where different documents are, where they're stored. You need people who have contact to people storing those, and you need to have contacts to institutions, to archives. Thank you, Iuditha. Dear Markus Stumpf, would you like to carry on? Yes, I'd love to. First of all, it was lovely listening. Yesterday, I logged on to the live stream, and now I wonder, what am I actually doing here? I feel like I'm just a person supposed to carry furniture. So you might ask yourself as well, what does that guy do here? Why is he here? That didn't become clear when I was introduced either. And I wrote that introduction, by the way. So we have an archive in my institution as well, but we are a Westphalian archive for literature and have been for 20 years. So I was invited by Jörg Albrecht. He had told me what was going to talk about here, and the big question was, can only German language texts belong in German literature archives, and can we make borders more fluid? So I thought about how can I make that tangible. And for the first question that came up was, what is a literature archive? If you look at it from an institution point of view, you have to say, well, everyone could be an archive. Everyone can open a literary archive if they want to, because it's not a trademarked term. Of course, there's many serious and also successful attempts as founding literature archives. There are those independent archives, but literary archives can also be a part of libraries, can develop also out of places of remembrance. If, for example, an author dies or is born in a house, then that house is often used for an archive. So what is actually an inventory? Well, easy, an accumulation of text, images, and sounds. Very often those are not put in a specific order, and then someone comes in and says, okay, this is an archive now because those documents are important and need to be preserved. So what do you find in those literary archives? From the perspective of literary or archival sciences, you have those estates, you have literary estates, and they are then formed into the inventory of an archive. They are put in order or put in disorder, as people working in archives often say when other people actually created an order, because everyone thinks that their order is the best. So those documents and then put in boxes, and then that constitutes an inventory, an archive holding. So is that always texts? Yes and no. I probably rather no. We should also discuss the question, what is a text actually? We can discuss about that for years. In archives, we find many things. There are texts, but there are also items that may contain text, but also things that are completely different. Photos, records, knick-knack, memorabilia, something that doesn't contain any text at all. Then we have databases, collection of notes. There might be bills, train tickets, bus tickets. Maybe you know the short story of Woody Allen, where he talks about laundry lists. He actually makes fun of literary scientists and archival scientists, because he says in this short story he creates the picture of someone who archives the laundry lists of a fictitious poet who is called Metterling. So that is the question you can ask yourself. There are goods that need to be archived, but there are also ungoods in that regard. There are bad items. If I look in an archive, I often see that there are many things that are missing in the archive, but I also see things that maybe shouldn't be in the archive, but now you can't throw them out anymore because they are part of the archive. About German language, of course, in German language archives, you don't only need to have German language texts. That is a question that is not really relevant because that was never really the case. There is no archive where only German texts are collected. If we think about the Goethe-Schiller archive, for example, those poets, those authors didn't only write in German, they wrote letters in other languages as well. And then we have estates of migrants in Marbach, for example. There's many texts, many material in other languages. And the question whether estates of German reading and German writing authors should be archived, and only if the question if only those German texts should be archived, I don't think anyone would agree with that. So there is no limitation there. And if we turn that around a little bit, and you could ask the following question, if a German archive would say, or if a German archive would be offered the estate of a Georgian author who never wrote in German, only in Georgian and Russian, who has no connection to Germany. So even if that author would have been important, any serious German archive would say, it doesn't really make sense. It would make more sense to archive that estate in Tiflis, in Georgia, because archives should always be there where they are useful, where they can be used by the population. So our main topic is literature, authors who live in Germany, maybe don't only have a 100% German background. Of course, the estates of those authors are very interesting to us. Let's stick with the Georgian example, Nino Haratishvili, for example. If that estate is offered to an archive in the future, all the archives will want to have that estate. We're talking about Post-Westphalian literature archives, so I asked myself the question, what does that mean? What does that term actually entail? As a historian, I think that attempt to take the Peace of Westphalia, activate it as political scientists do, and I don't really agree with that. Post-Westphalian world order is something that is said in political science, but most historians don't really agree with that. I think it's an interesting term. It's really interesting because I didn't think of the post-Westphalian world order first. I thought about the question, what is actually Westphalian? I wasn't born here in Westphalia, but I've lived here for quite some time. And now I work in an institution that belongs to an association that is very much based in Westphalia, which is maybe even fixated on Westphalia. And I still can't answer the question, what does actually define Westphalian literature? How can we define that? How can you actually measure that? I don't think you can. And if we look at the inventory of my archive, the Westphalian Literature Archive, what are we archiving? We are archiving the words of Westphalian authors. And who are those? Are that authors who were born in Westphalia? Yes, they're born here or they have anything to do with Westphalia. Droste Hülshoff probably saw herself as Westphalian, but not only as Westphalian. That is clear. Who was the founding author of our archive? That was the poet Ernst Meister from Hagen. And he actually has a lovely quote. He says, it's really lovely to see how through many friends my poems have been brought to the furthest away regions in Westphalia. And I often thought an apple that falls from the tree can come to rest right next to the trunk, but it can also roll somewhere else. And wherever the apple stays, that apple always remains the apple from that specific tree. And Ernst Meister didn't want to have his estate in the archive of Marbach. He wanted to have his estate in Westphalia. But that's not the rule. That's the exception. A couple of years ago, for example, we took a part of Wiglaf Droste's estate. He was born in Herford in 1922, and he then moved on to Berlin, to Leipzig, then to Upper Franconia. So is Wiglaf Droste, is he a Westphalian? Well, he was born here, but his works, I don't think they have anything to do with Westphalia. And in 2008, Tilman Ramstedt, who was born in Bielefeld, he received the Droste Award. And in his speech, he said, well, thank you for that award, but why am I getting this award? I'm not really a Westphalian author. Or why do you think I'm a Westphalian author? So that's maybe something that we can talk about in a minute. I think we need to really broaden our horizon. Right now, the inventories that we have in our archive got here by accident, you could really say. But what is important, and that is something that we heard again and again, is that we want to really reflect the diversity of languages and literature that exists in this region. We want to reflect and document that in our archive. And you said that in your introduction. Authors and Beikurt, for example, they also need to be put into our archives. That is very clear. And this year in the Marbach Literature Archive, a document was posted, and Sandra Richter looked at what the literature archive of the future would be. And she said an archive always takes on the political circumstances, but it's not a political archive. In the sense of Enlightenment, an archive needs to be neutral, needs to be impartial. It collects without regard to nationality, gender, or opinion, but pays all the more attention to the representation in the archive of that which is literally and intellectually significant, provided it is in German language, originated in Germany, or was created in the context of German or German language culture. And we said, if Europe doesn't exist, and then Westphalia doesn't exist either.
Thank you very much for those very interesting insights. All three of them were very different, but nonetheless they had something in common. We all agree that the cultural life of immigrant life in Germany has to be collected and has to be archived. Mr. Gogos, you wrote a book about it. You wrote a book about the process of this grassroots movement from the Turkish archive that was founded in Essen until the opening of this Museum of Immigration in Cologne. And the last sentence in your book before the acknowledgement is, and I quote, that the Post-Migrant Museum can almost be thought of as a place where the post-migrant society learns to understand itself, not least by post-traumatic means. In this way, the Post-Migrant Museum could support the immigrant society in establishing a new transnational narrative community and in weaving a new, truly participatory, simultaneously worldly and utopian post-migrant we that no longer knows an exclusive you. I share this desire, and that is why I chose this quote, and that is why I wanted to read it here in front of all of you. I share this desire, but I would like to ask whether that wish, that desire, that institutions support the immigrant society in establishing a new transnational narrative community, making knowledge accessible to the public. Isn't that wish addressed to all literary and cultural institutions and not just the museum that you designed, that you thought about. So it doesn't even just suit the dormit or your imagination, but everything else as well, except the dormit. So all institutions. I say that because the dormit, as you said, isn't a literature archive. It's a collection of objects, of items. Some of it has to do with literature, other informations, but the estate, for example, or parts of the estate of Fakir Baykut can't be found in that archive. Or at least they're not, well, then there's no information on that. So the opening of this house, the founding of this house is also a sort of question to all the other archives, the Fritz Höser archive, for example. So it's not something that you desire from dormit. That's not how I read it. It's more of a description of the status quo, of the foundation of this archive, and at the same time it's a demand. It's something that you want from others, but I'm sure that many people will interpret it differently. They are going to say, okay, now dormit exists, and they are dealing with that. And I think that might be a bit of a risk. Would you maybe want to share your reflections on that? That's a very good question, and it's very justified. The utopia, of course, goes much further than just opening a house like that. It's a social utopia that I kind of design at the end as a forecast. I wrote on the Museum of Future. That was the topic of the anthology. And there I said something different. There I wrote, the Museum of the Future will be post-migrant or it will not be at all. It won't exist. So that refers to all institutions. So if you think about city museums, for example, if the city society should be represented in a city museum and the migration societies that we see on the streets, so the people who live in those cities, the migrant society is important. And if that is not reflected in museums, then at some point those museums will be deserted because there won't be a context. Nobody will have a sort of relationship to those museums. So, of course, all this has to grow. And the topic of migration, and that is part of the post-migrant of that term, refers to the transformative process that affects all of us in all institutions. And migration, just like you said, I think is something that has an impact on everything, that is connected to everything. Nonetheless, I think it is important to have a place, a central place where these narratives, the stories of migrant and post-migrant societies meet is very important. This collective memory, we need a sort of center for that. I think that is an advantage. So there is this decentralized moment, but I think at the same time, yes, we have to open a center. There needs to be a room for that. Yes, so it's sort of, you ask for people to open that sort of room, and it's actually happening. You're describing those processes. And I think it's very interesting that you don't just talk about Post-Westphalia, but also about post-migration. And you refer to the museum as a post-migrant museum. But if we look at the Fritz Höser Institution or the LWL Literature Archive, then I don't think we can call that post-migrant. So would you say that we are talking about two different worlds, two different archive terms in terms of societies, ideas of societies? Because I ask myself, how can we agree, not just in this discussion, but also in our day-to-day work? Very often, I feel like when people talk about the post-migrant, many institutional organizations are sort of scared because it's a statement, it's a political term. And Mr. Gogos, when you use that term, then I don't see it in a I don't understand it in a political way. It's more of a cultural era, a migrant, post-migrant area. Nonetheless, it is a term that is understood as a political term, and that is why I would like to ask you, Mr. Stumpf. Ms. Richter said that it's not the archive, Marbach isn't a political archive. But it's also not a place where post-migrant literature or these aspects are being collected. So could we say that the German Literature Archive, Marchive, the way it is right now, without wanting to criticize it at all, or without criticizing you as the head of that office, but how can we all reach how can we agree on something if we start using terms that don't exist in your archive? Same applies to the Fritz Hüser archive. Iuditha, I really appreciate your work, but at the end, it's a fact that Beikut's estates can't be found there, despite the fact that they should be there. And post-migrant society requires us to understand that heritage and to integrate it. Iuditha, did you want to add something to that? Yes, I would love to, because first of all, I wanted to also say something concerning your question to Manuel Gogos, whether it's not sort of risky to open DOMIT. Might that not lead to other archives saying, well, okay, now we have a centralized place where all that post-migrant literature is collected, so now it's not up to us anymore. Whether that is a risk, that was the question. I think that luckily we simply can't afford that anymore. Social discussions, social political discussions in our post-migrant society about the necessity of diversity and about reflecting diversity have become really loud. There's so many voices that ask for that, and that is why institutions luckily simply can't afford to not listen to those voices. And regarding the storage of certain collections and estates in certain estates, well, I think it's not even that important that a certain estate can be found in a certain archive. What is important is that that estate can be found somewhere and that all other archives or people interested know where to find it. So what we really need is more cooperation between literal archives and non-literal archives in this regard. We live in a society where information is one of the most important goods, and I think we should really use that when it comes to the archives. So actually, that makes me want to ask a question that I wanted to ask later, but I think it's a perfect moment for that. Iuditha, Mr. Stumpf, Mr. Gogos, when would be the right time? Iuditha, you were so right when you said we simply can't afford it. So yesterday would have been the right time to start opening or working with a post-migrant heritage to integrate that into the existing archives. But that's simply not the case. So when would be the perfect time? What do we need? You just said it yesterday. We should have acted yesterday. And I'd like to also talk about what was just mentioned, that post-migrant is sort of a scary term. Well, why would people get scared if it's not even part of the discourse, of the discussion? I'm under the impression that in our world, in the archive world, that's not part of the discussion. Yes, it has arrived, the term has arrived in other spheres, in the non-literal spheres. It's a very big topic, migration, post-migration. Yes, We want to document that in Germany, but we do have the following problem, and that's why I think the question was very justified, whether DOMIT is also a risk, because archives think very much about, okay, who's responsible for that? So first of all, that happens on a regional level, for example. And that's where archives are responsible. In literature, it's different. So, okay, let's not focus on Westphalia, where we think we're responsible for Westphalian authors. But here we need a documentation profile. That's what we need. That's where we describe what it's really about, and that's where we sort of describe what we want to collect. And that's why, no, it's not yesterday, it is today. Today is the right time to start. That's why I think it's important that we're meeting here, because now is the time to introduce that into the discourse within literature archives. I'm under the impression that so far that's not established. We tend to speak about responsibilities, different authorities, and then we do have associations. But what actually happens is that there's not that much cooperation in the end, because everybody thinks, oh, I'm sure the other archive is going to deal with it. And that brings me back to DOMIT. I think there is a certain risk. Some colleagues will probably now lay back and say, okay, well, now we have this amazing museum for migration that works with the archive in Köln-Kalk, so it's not up to us anymore. But it's not a literature archive. But it might have a department. We don't know that yet. But it's not a literature archive. Iuditha, you wanted to say something. You raised your hand.
Yes, thank you. I think it's very right. I totally agree with you, Mr. Stumpf. And I think we really need to counter that. And we need to counter it by supporting, by strengthening authors in understanding or in thinking about their estate and how their estate is going to be dealt with at one point in time. We need to support them there. We need to show them how they can make contracts with archives, for example, what archives would come into question for them, would be an option for them. And I think information is the most important step here. So when it comes to communication between the different archives and also the communication of archives with authors. An important example here is the following. I really want to mention that Adas Öhlin and Emine Segen-Östermann have already given their estate to the Academy of the Arts in Berlin, and their estates have been accepted and they have been integrated into an archive. There's the Adas Öhlin archive in the Academy of the Arts in Berlin, and there's also the Emine Segen-Östermann archive. And those are the only authors with a Turkish background or the only authors who also wrote in Turkish, who emigrated from Turkey. Those are the only authors with that background that can be found in German archives right now. There's also specific artifacts. There's different pieces in communal archives. For example, they're not in literature archives, but in communal archives. Because in the 60s, 70s, and the 80s, literature was understood or funded as social work and was supported via social work. Therefore, it fell under social services and not under literature, and that's how those pieces ended up in communal archives. And that shows how important it is. Iuditha, you said it, how important it is to archive those documents. But there's also a document that's called Kauschak. It's in the city's archive in Herford, but only a part of that volume is there. But if you find it in those archives because it was supported, it was funded via social services. However, that specific volume is one of the most important multilingual works that we have in Germany. So what's important here is, yes, we have a couple of points that we can connect to, but this work is still there. This is still to be done. DOMIT has been founded. Mr. Gogos talked about the collective memory of the migrant society. Dr. Esley just talked about the narratives of migrant society. So in the active scientific discourse, many things are coming together already, and that's how we conceptualize this workshop, of course, but also outside of this conference, outside of this workshop, these discourses are being held, and often they're titled with the keyword post-migrant. That is a small problem. That stays a problem because that term is a political term, such as Post-Westphalian. That's also a political term. And you underlined that you liked that term, but you said at the same time that you are not a political scientist, but it is a term that comes from political sciences. Post-migrant is not a term that comes from political sciences, but it is used to speed up societal changes, also in politics. There's not post-migrant narratives yet. And as you, Mr. Gogos, use the term of post-migrant, that is not general knowledge. You use it in a way that underlines that this is your image of the migrant society. But it is fact that this term post-migrant is used in politics. And there are specific scenes, there are specific areas who just won't use that term. An archive should be a neutral and impartial place, and that's why I see that danger there. If we don't depoliticize, if we don't normalize those terms, such as the term of post-migrant, and if we don't use that term in a more natural process, not as a political term, if we don't do that, archives won't take on that knowledge, because that knowledge is going to be seen as political discourse or even a political fight. So that's just how I see it. It's right that you use the term as you do, but I still am worried about the fact that using those terms leads to archives not wanting to touch this material because they say this is too political for us, this is too current to us, we are not going to touch it. Maybe I'm too skeptical here, but I just wanted to mention it. I think Mr. Gogos wanted to say something, correct? I can go later. Yeah, you're talking about me all the time, as if I wasn't there with you in the room. Post-migrant? Yes, I agree. It's being used as a political term. I don't think that's a disadvantage. There are justified political demands connected to that term. For example, when it comes to the demand that we need to focus on this history. And therefore, that political demand is very valid. Post-migrant is a term that comes from theater, so it comes from a literary context. But I wanted to come back to DOMIT, and what we collect. DOMIT was mentioned again and again as a source of danger for the German cultural scene. So there's a danger emanating from DOMIT because no one else is going to do anything in this regard now. I would say this is progress. If there is a place where people see, hey, this is where this specific document will have a home, those things aren't just thrown out in the streets anymore. Let me give you an example. I visited the Bavarian broadcasting service. for decades had a television show that was broadcast in the language of guest workers. And the entire archive of that TV show was just thrown out, in the trash. I went there and I got those documents, I got those records, I took them out of the trash, literally, to save them. So it's good that these things have a home now. Now let's make the connection to literature and culture. Domit comes from the guest worker research, but Domit has always seen these people as creative people, people that create culture, because this is about everyday culture. They made music that is also interconnected. There's figures who worked at the assembly line at Ford. In the morning and in the evening, they were pop stars. And there are millions of records that have been sold in Germany without the majority society noticing it. They didn't even hear those records. So it's a good thing that there is a space now for those cultural goods. And that brings me to my next point. What is the connection to other archives or other institutions of the cultural mainstream? And I see the opportunity for cooperation here, because everyone needs to be involved. This is relevant to everyone. If we look at the history of guest workers in this country, then let's take hip-hop. Let's take the history of hip-hop in Germany. The children of guest workers were instrumental to hip-hop. They co-invented hip-hop in Germany. They identified with the black ghettos in the US. They created their own language or their own way of rapping. They were the first people who rapped in German and also in Turkish. But it means that this is not just foreign music that was produced and listened to in Germany. No, it means that from that migrant history, impulses emanate that impact the mainstream culture. And the same is true for literature. If we talk about Beikus, then you could say, okay, this is maybe guest worker literature, and you could say if Domit has a library, then Beikud has its place there. But what about Göslem? Would we have to separate? Would we have to divide his works? Would we have to say his first works don't have anything to do with migrant history, so that should be in the German literature archive, and then the rest should be in the German literature archive? That should be at Domit? Strange. So I say we should really work together here. And Domit doesn't stop with guest worker history. When we look at cultural history, if we look at post-migrant history, then I think that the different archives should reach out to each other and should find an intelligent way of working together. Because in the end, it's going to be a competition. The archives are going to compete for the estates of different authors. And those estates are going to be interesting to all those archives. Thank you. I would love to open up the discussion. I would love to enable the audience to answer questions now, because I see two people raising their hands. Or would you like to contribute something, or would you like to say something, Mr. Stumpf? I just wanted to make something clear. I 100% agree with the fact that archives should cooperate. I'm just worried about one thing, and I know my colleagues. I'm worried that they understand teamwork as a system where someone else does your work and they don't have to do it. So that's just the worry that I have. So post-migrant, that term being a political term, that's not going to stop archives from archiving those things. I think which is more important is that you need to point out to them that that literature is important, that it needs to be pointed out to them. This workshop is an important step, can be a step there, but we definitely need to make sure that the different archives understand that they need to archive those documents as well. I don't think that they are scared of that term post-migrant. I don't believe it. Maybe I'm too optimistic, but I think that the practical problems are more important here. They might think, oh, we don't have anyone here in our team who speaks Turkish or Kurdish, so those practical problems might be the issue when specific estates aren't accepted into an archive, or if they are offered that archives say, hey, maybe this fits better with another archive. So I think the practical issues are more important here. And I don't think that in my archive, the Westphalian Literature Archive, that we ever were in a situation where we had to turn down interesting documents. But you said you have interesting context there. Maybe we can come back to that.
Yes, I would love to keep the discussion running. There's so much more to talk about, but unfortunately we have to come to the end of the discussion. And I would like to actually ask the audience whether anybody would like to add something or ask questions. Yes, please. Go ahead. I'm not sure who was first. I think I saw two hands. Wonderful. I work in the Literary Commission, and we cooperate with the archive authorities. We cooperate and we work together on the Westphalian Literature Archive, and that is why I wanted to explain why at the moment our authors are so homogeneous. This has to do that the archive holding, usually it takes a while to collect works. So at the moment, we are dealing with authors who were born in the 1940s. And back then, there simply weren't that many authors of that generation who had a Turkish or an Arabic background. I'm sure this is something that will change in the next year. But Feridun Samoglu would be someone, for example, who is simply too young. We are still kind of working on the older generations, on archiving them. That is why I think we are probably reaching a point where the archive holdings in the next years are going to change because there is this change in generations. Yes, please. Is there a definition for post-migrant literature? I think from what I understood, they are first guest workers or children of guest workers, and that's mainly Turkey. Are there also Greek, Iranian, South American, Eastern European, also other authors write books? Or you mentioned the Japanese author, but are you focusing on work on guest workers, on Turkish guest workers, or does that term refer to other groups as well? Mr. Gogos, I think that question goes to you. Did you hear the question? Yes, of course. The answer would be no. Post-migrant doesn't just refer to Turkish, German literature, and I think that should be clear by that term. Migrant is something transnational, diaspora, and everybody with a migration background is meant by that, is included. And I think in the long run, post-migrant is defined, or to define that is a utopia or a political society, a general society where everybody who is part of that society is affected or has a migration background. So it is a social process, and that means that post-migrant literature has many voices, many languages. It's a narrative that is very diverse, and it doesn't have to do with German, Turkish guest workers in that sense. Yes, please. One more question. Thank you very much for the presentation. I thought it was very interesting to follow the discussion, but I come from a different perspective. So it's a lot of symbolism, what we heard about the archive work, about collecting works. And my experience is quite different. I conducted a study on intercultural, the intercultural situation in different cities in Germany, Eastern German cities and Western German cities. I visited the city archives, and regarding the documentation, I gotta say, it wasn't too impressive. What was interesting was that in Jena and in Gera, so in Eastern Germany, the representation was well better than in Western Germany. And then I realized, okay, those symbolic debates on post-migration and so on are really politically fueled, so that the municipal level, where the daily life of migration and its consequences takes place, that is not even included in those collections. I think that's great that you collect authors that you mentioned, but this day-to-day story of migration, that is something where I think that we should keep that in mind, and the city archives have to be involved. They have to be the ones to say, okay, there's a cultural story of migration. This intercultural week has been happening for decades. It takes place every year. Many people visit it. I visited Frankfurt, and the director told me that I was the first one in 50 years to go there and visit the archive. There is this day-to-day story, and post-migration doesn't play a role there. The question here is, what was our day-to-day life? How did we live? How did the Germans see us? How did they produce us? How did we produce ourselves? And those stories, I think, are way more important that cities at a municipal level, bottom up, develop an understanding of heterogeneity. And I think, to be honest, to say that this is not political, Mr. Gogos, I'm sure your book is amazing and I will read it. I'm looking forward. But to say that the future the future museum can only be post-migrant, that's a super political question. It's very exclusive. It's not integrative. Because I look at the different social structures and I look at authors, writers, I look at the Commissioner for Integration who organized those intercultural weeks. And there's so much knowledge that we could use. And we have to focus on the different levels, and we have to sort of tune it down a little bit. And I sort of feel uncomfortable that those political discourses can lead to the opposite. Neither the Commissioner for Integration in Jena nor in Gera understand or work with the term transculturality or post-migration. And here I think the city archives play a very important role. Thank you very much. Mr. Gogos, would you like to answer if you want? I can't see you right now, but would you like to comment on that?
Also, ich glaube, ich bin gar nicht der Apostel des Postmigrantischen.
I don't think that I'm really the spokesman for post-migration. That's not really my topic. Yes, it's kind of controversial, a bit of a provocative end to my book. But the Domit collection and the book, I think, both are very down to earth, very much focusing on the daily life of archiving, of collecting pieces and the stories that are collected at Domit. And what really motivates me is the daily life. Maybe the daily life is something that I would describe as something being post-migrant. But the daily life is where I think we have a communality. And for the background of a Domit archive, I would say Fakir Baykut was mentioned a couple of times today. One of the founding fathers of Domit is Tayfun Demir. He lived in Duisburg in the late 70s. He was asked to open a library for special visitors, so a guest workers' library. So we're right there in the daily life, in the city society, and even more, they organized a bus, and with that bus they went into the suburbs where they offered education to Turkish children. And with Tayfun Demir, just one example, Baikit Bakur went out there and they started reading out their books to those children. And that's what matters to me, the day-to-day life, the culture there. And then the question is, of course, where are those stories told? And I would say Domit is a good place for that, but it's definitely not the only place. Yes, those buses, by the way, were called the Turk buses. And in my dissertation, I focused on that because it was one of the most important campaigns in literature that was also financed by the federal government. And the number of archive holdings, everything that was collected back then, that was impressive. Unfortunately, a lot got lost. That's also part of reality. Many of those multilingual books sort of disappear at some point. They're being thrown out, but Fakir Baykut, his traces can be found in Duisburg. There's a cultural prize, and you can also, unfortunately, there's not that much you can find about him in the city archive, but the stories that you tell us here, or the stories that I tell you about the Turk bus, I am telling them because I want those stories to be told. And in the past they weren't told, but you wanted to add to that. Yes, the municipal archives, that's a very important information. And I think one thing that you have to know when you talk about municipal archives is the following. Sponsoring, funding was always very important. So who is paying for what? The municipality, for example, is taking that over. That's the core business. And in the 19th century, that worked pretty well. Municipal authorities worked well, and that way the sort of memory was there, and that is simply not the case today. There is a tendency that shows that the administrations get smaller, and that is why that has to go somewhere else. It's a process that takes time. And the Federal Conference is really trying to make sure that something happens here. Documentation profiles are an important step in order to make sure that it is clear that migration, post-migration is reflected in the archives, that there is research, that research can be done on that topic in 10 or 20 years. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the participants. I would like to thank the panelists, everybody who's in the room. I would like to thank the CLF team. And I would like to thank you, Jörg, for organizing this workshop. I hope you all enjoy the evening. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing what will happen with the archives in the near future. Thank you very much.